The first time he ever called me a phase, I laughed because I thought he was joking. We were sitting in his tiny Brooklyn apartment, the kind with exposed brick that people romanticize until they realize there's no insulation, no heat, and the neighbors scream at each other in 3 languages. I had just read him the first chapter of my new manuscript, shaky-voiced and flushed from 2 glasses of cheap Malbec, and when I looked up at him, expecting something like pride or even teasing admiration, all I got was a shrug, and that word, phase. "You'll get over it," he said, pulling a blanket over his knees and glancing back at his laptop screen. "Writers are always like this. It's an identity crisis, not a career." The blood drained from my face so fast I thought I might pass out. But instead of arguing, I just nodded, feeling something fragile inside me retreat. He didn't even notice. He didn't notice when I stopped bringing my laptop over, when I stopped talking about the writing group I'd joined, or the short story that had just gotten long-listed for a small literary magazine. He never even asked if I'd submitted the novel I had spent 2 years shaping. Instead, he started asking more and more about things like savings accounts and job stability, and whether I thought I could really handle a life of uncertainty. Once, when we were brushing our teeth together, side by side in the cramped bathroom that reeked of mildew, he said, "I can't wait until you settle down and get this whole writing bug out of your system." That night, I lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, and for the first time since we met, I realized I wasn't in love with him. I was in love with who I thought he was when I was still trying to be someone I wasn't. He called me a phase like I was a bad haircut, a brief flirtation with identity, a thing to grow out of. But what he didn't know was that every word he said to me, every little condescending smirk, every time he talked over me in front of his friends, was going somewhere. I wasn't just writing anymore. I was recording, cataloging, memorizing the way his tone dipped into sarcasm, the way his left eye twitched when he thought he was being clever, the way he leaned back when I spoke like he was bracing himself. Against my ambition. I didn't confront him. I didn't fight him. I just started writing faster. My protagonist didn't begin as him, not at first. She had a complicated past, a rage she didn't understand, and a deep love for stories that no one around her took seriously. But slowly, inevitably, he seeped in. His words, his habits, his small humiliations. He became the man who questioned her sanity when she dreamed too loud, the man who loved her only when she was quiet, polite, and small, the man who told her she wasn't real, she was temporary. The scenes came alive with his voice. His cruelty wasn't overt. It was subtle, passive-aggressive, the kind that left bruises without ever touching skin. Readers would later call him insidiously realistic, the kind of villain you didn't see coming until it was too late. By the time we broke up, he still thought I hadn't finished the novel. He still thought I hadn't really tried. He said he wished me luck on my little creative detour and hoped I'd find a more reliable path someday. I nodded, smiled, and let him go. He didn't know that the manuscript was already with an agent. He didn't know that the first publisher who read it made an offer within 2 weeks. He didn't know that I had wept alone in my new apartment, not because I missed him, but because for the first time in years, I had chosen myself, and someone else had, too. And when the book hit shelves, and interviews started rolling in, and the reviews began calling the villain unnervingly intimate, he still didn't know. He didn't know until the day he texted me, months after the book tour, months after the press coverage, and asked if the character was based on him. I waited 2 days before I replied. "No," I wrote, "he's worse." The message hung between us like fog in a field after midnight, thick, cold, and unrelenting. I saw the typing bubbles appear and disappear 3 times before he finally sent a single-word reply. Oh, I didn't respond. I didn't have to. Because by then, the interviews had already started twisting the blade. They asked me about the villain, always with that delicate hesitation, like they were afraid I might recoil from the topic. But I never did. I leaned in. I smiled. I told the truth, at least the version I had the right to claim. I said he was an amalgam, a collage of many voices I had known, many hands that had tried to rearrange my edges to fit their frames. I said he was fiction, but that fiction has a way of pulling from the bone marrow of memory. What I didn't say was that he was the whisper in my head that used to make me question whether I deserved any of it. The voice that told me to apologize for taking up space, for being loud, for wanting, that he was the ghost of every moment I had ever shrunk myself so someone else could feel bigger. The villain in my book wasn't a murderer or a thief. He was worse. He was believable. He was charming in a dinner party sort of way. Well-read, well-dressed, disarming. He'd pull out your chair and then belittle your dreams. He'd memorize your vulnerabilities and then use them as punchlines, in front of his friends. He didn't yell. He sighed. He didn't argue. He dismissed. He told the heroine she was dramatic, that she made things up, that she was too much and not enough in the same breath. Readers sent me letters, hundreds of them, saying how real he felt. Some hated him. Some said he reminded them of someone they used to love. Some said he reminded them of themselves. The strangest thing was that I never had to tell them what he looked like. They all imagined him exactly as he was, because they'd met him too. In different cities, in different rooms, under different names. I never intended the novel to become a phenomenon. I just wanted it to be honest. But it spread like spilled ink, quiet and unstoppable. Book clubs picked it apart, influencers highlighted, passages in Instagram captions, and eventually the adaptation offers started trickling in, and that was when it happened. He emailed me. Not text, not a DM. An actual email with a subject line that read, "We should talk." It was strange seeing his name in my inbox, floating there like an old photograph you'd thought you burned. I didn't open it for 2 days. When I finally did, his words tried so hard to sound casual I could hear the strain through the screen. He said he was proud of me. That he always knew I had something special. That he felt honored to have been part of my journey. And then, like a parasite nesting in the center of kindness, he added, "I think we owe each other some closure." Closure. The word made me laugh. Out loud, a short, sharp sound that startled even me. He wanted closure now that I had made something of myself. Now that the world knew my name and the publisher had greenlit a sequel. Now that producers were whispering about casting choices for the film version of his character. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. My silence was a better mirror than any words I could craft. Still, that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there thinking about all the nights I spent curled around the ache of not feeling seen. About the way I had convinced myself he was right. That wanting to be a writer was selfish, childish, unrealistic. About the small deaths I had endured. In his presence. The kind of deaths that leave no autopsy, just a faint echo of who you used to be. I remembered the night he skipped my reading because he had a thing at work. The time he told me a real job would make me happier. The way he looked bored when I read him my favorite paragraph. The one that would eventually make strangers cry. And then I remembered the first time I sat alone in my new apartment, with nothing but a candle and a laptop and the soft hiss of the city outside my window. I remembered how terrifying it was to choose myself. How the quiet screamed at first. How I kept writing anyway. He hadn't just inspired a villain. He'd taught me what one looked like without needing claws or violence. He had shown me how erasure could wear a kind smile, how abuse could hide in suggestion. In the sequel, the villain returns. Of course he does. Villains always think they deserve a second chance, but this time, the heroine is stronger. She doesn't shrink. She doesn't beg. She doesn't need his validation because she's found her own voice, and it's louder than any of his silences. Thy best revenge is not success. It's freedom. It's no longer needing to look back. It's knowing that they were wrong and you were always right to begin with. By the time I sat across from the Hollywood producer in the quiet corner of a Soho cafe, my hands no longer trembled when I talked about my work. The scriptwriter beside her, a soft-eyed woman with a mess of notes and passion in her voice, asked if I would mind if they made the villain even more layered. I smiled, slow and certain, and told her to do what she needed, as long as the wounds felt real, because they were. They were still tender, though I'd grown skin over them, strong and thick and written in ink. The heroine was no longer just a mirror of me. She had become larger, stranger, more furious, more radiant. But her grief, that raw, confusing grief of loving someone who needed you small, was still mine. After the option deal was signed, I went home and cried. Not because I was overwhelmed, not because I couldn't believe it. I cried because there was no one to text, no one to call, no one to sit beside me on the couch and pour wine and whisper, "You did it, babe." He had always said I romanticized pain, that I made everything bigger than it was. But he had no idea what it meant to hold your own story in your hands, to look at every page and remember what it cost you. He had no idea that the loneliness of creation isn't tragic. It's sacred. It's the quiet birth of something no one else believed in. He used to ask me over breakfast and sarcasm, "What's the end game here? A book tour? Oprah's book club?" With a smirk, with that incredulous laugh that said, "Be serious." And I used to shrug and say, "I don't know." Like I hadn't dreamed of those exact things since I was 12. Now they were asking me for essays, appearances, quotes. A big literary podcast asked me to come on and talk about writing emotionally authentic antagonists. I said yes. I wore the red dress he said made me look like I was trying too hard. I let the makeup artist give me a bold lip, the one he once wiped off with a napkin at a restaurant and muttered, "It's too much." I told the podcast host that writing villains was easy when you understood manipulation, when you knew what it was like to be made to feel like your feelings were a burden, your dreams an inconvenience. I spoke softly, like confession, but I didn't flinch. The host leaned in. People always lean in when you speak like your ribs are still cracking open. After it aired, my inbox filled again. People thanking me. People saying they hadn't had a name for what they'd been through until my novel gave them one. A woman in her 70s wrote that she'd left her husband of 45 years after reading my book because he'd been silencing me for decades, and I didn't even hear it until now. I sat with that letter in my lap for a long time. Then, I got his second email. This one was shorter, less curated. Angrier, though he tried to mask it in concern. He wrote, "I'm not the man you wrote about. That's not fair. You made me into a villain because it suited your story. You painted me cruel when I was just trying to be honest with you. That's not abuse. That's realism." And oh, I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly him. So audacious, so tone-deaf, so sure of his own good intentions, that he couldn't see the rot in them. It was always realism when he doubted me, practicality when he discouraged me, concern when he tried to control me. He didn't realize that every woman I knew had met a man like him. A man who made her feel like an unpaid intern in her own life. A man who thought he was being helpful while dismantling her piece by piece. I didn't reply to the second email either. But I did write a new scene, one that didn't exist in the original manuscript. A scene where the villain writes the heroine, a letter full of rationalizations, wounded pride, and that same slippery tone that says, "You're the one with the problem." And in the scene, the heroine doesn't even read it. She throws it away, unread, and then goes to the window and watches the sun rise over a world that is finally hers. The editor asked me if the scene was necessary. I told her it was the most necessary thing I'd ever written. When the press started, leaking casting announcements, when they revealed who would play him, his silence was thunderous. I knew he'd seen it. I knew it stung. The actor they picked had a reputation for playing soft-spoken villains, men who smile while cutting you open. It was a perfect fit. A month before production began, I got a letter in the mail, not an email, not a message, a real letter, written in ink on thick cream paper, folded twice with care. It didn't have his name on it, but I knew the handwriting. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. The letter wasn't angry. It was regretful. It was desperate. He said he didn't realize he'd hurt me, that he wished he could take it back, that he was willing to grow if I would just give him a chance to understand. He said he missed the way I used to look at him, and that no one had ever looked at him like that again. He wrote that maybe I was right to write about it, but that I didn't have to destroy him in the process. But I hadn't destroyed him. He had. I just wrote it down. Still, I folded the letter carefully and put it in a drawer. Not because I wanted to keep it, but because I wanted to remember exactly who he was the next time I doubted myself. Not the monster, not the caricature. The man. The kind of man who asks for forgiveness without ever fully apologizing. The movie was in pre-production now. The costume designer reached out and asked if I had opinions on his wardrobe. I sent back 3 pages of notes. I told her he always wore navy. It made him feel safe, respectable, unremarkable. He never liked bold colors. I told her about the shoes he always shined, the watch he checked when I spoke too long, the glasses he only wore when he wanted to look smarter than everyone in the room. I wanted him rendered perfectly. Not as revenge, but as record. This wasn't a story anymore. It was documentation. The first time I saw his face on the big screen, I was sitting in the back row of a private screening room, knees pulled to my chest under the soft velvet of the seat, heart thundering like it was about to rip itself free from my ribs. The actor, playing him, walked into the frame with that careful, calculated grace. He tilted his head at the heroine like he already knew her, like he'd already decided how far she would go before she broke. He smiled the way I remembered him smiling, just a little crooked, just a little too pleased with himself. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I didn't flinch. I watched. Every word of his dialogue had been mine first, mined from memory, scrubbed through layers of shame and honesty, filtered through fiction. The words landed in the dark like slow poison, the kind you don't taste until it's too late. Around me, the room was silent, the kind of silence you get when the truth is so close you can't breathe around it. The heroine on screen didn't look like me, but her eyes were mine, wide and burning with the realization that love, when warped, becomes a trap. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just sat there, blinking slowly, as if coming out of a long, deep sleep. When the lights came up, the producer reached over and squeezed my hand. She whispered, "You did something important." I didn't answer, because I already knew. I had known since I wrote the first sentence, since I slipped into my heroine's skin like armor and carved my history into her spine. Since I made him into a story, and in doing so, made him small enough to finally carry. When the film premiered, it received a 10-minute standing ovation. I stood backstage, hidden in the wings, not because I was afraid, but because I needed a moment alone to listen to applause meant for every version of me that had ever been silenced. I thought of the girl I used to be, the one who tiptoed around his moods, who kept her dreams folded up like laundry no one would wear. I imagined whispering into her ear, "You survive this, and one day they'll clap for your survival." after. The premiere, reporters crowded around me with microphones and questions, and I answered every one of them with clarity and calm. Then, one of them asked, point blank, "Is it true the villain was based on a real ex?" I didn't flinch. I said, "He wasn't based on one man. He was based on a pattern." There was a hush then, the kind that always follows a truth people aren't quite ready for. But I was ready. I was always ready now. Later that week, I got another letter. This time, it came from his sister. She said she'd seen the film and that she knew it was him. She didn't say it with accusation. She said it with understanding. She said she had always tried to believe he meant well, but watching that story unfold had unsettled something deep in her. "I think I let him hurt people because I didn't want to see it," she wrote. "I'm sorry. You deserved to be seen." That letter broke me in a way his never could, because someone had seen, someone other than me. A few days later, my publisher called to tell me the second book was on the bestseller list. Again, the sequel, where the heroine doesn't just survive the villain, she rebuilds. She finds her voice not as defiance, but as birthright. She writes her own ending. The final chapter ends with her walking into a bookstore and seeing her story in the window. She stands there, in the cold, looking at her own name in gold letters. Not triumphant, not gloating, just whole. She doesn't go inside. She doesn't need to. She already knows what's in those pages because she lived it, and so did I. The night the sequel dropped, I hosted a small gathering in my apartment. My new apartment, the one filled with light and plants and bookshelves that reached the ceiling. People I loved were there. My agent, my writing group, 2 old friends who'd believed in me when I didn't know how to believe in myself. We raised glasses of Prosecco and read favorite lines from the book aloud. No one toasted to revenge. We toasted to resurrection. I never told them which lines were pulled straight from things he'd said. It didn't matter anymore. They weren't his anymore. They were mine now, repurposed, rewritten. When the noise died down and the last guest left, I sat alone on the couch and opened my laptop. There was one last email from him. This time, the subject line was blank. Just his name and the timestamp. I stared at it. I didn't open it. I deleted it. No dramatic closure. No response. No scene to write. Because the story was over. And I had pages to fill with something better. No more villains. No more shadows dressed as lovers. No more silence pretending to be peace, just light, just truth, and stories that belong to me.